Excuse me. Ugh. So how you doing? It's Monday. Happy Monday. Thank you, Druid. It's that kind of day where a turtle rides by on a duck. So yeah, happy Monday. Did you guys have a good weekend? Did you do anything interesting? I probably overdid it this weekend, but knock on wood, I'm not feeling the effects. On Saturday, I did move some furniture around, did some organization. It probably looks messier than it did when I started. But I found some treasures. Don't you love that when you like clean out something or reorganize your stuff and you're like, oh, I forgot I had this, or oh my goodness, where'd this come from? Story of my life. Yeah, so I found some fun things. I thought maybe I could do a little show and tell on Thursday. Found some stuff I made, and not that I really forgot about it, but I kind of packed it away and not given it much thought. But I could get you guys advice on something. So we'll look at that on Thursday. What did I do with my notes? Here we go. So, I often forget to talk about the quilt behind me, and most of the time it's not a terribly important quilt, although, you know, sometimes I put some up that I'm pretty proud of. But this one is super special. This one was made by my great-grandmother, or, well, let me qualify that. It was pieced by my great-grandmother, and my grandmother finished the quilt. And so this is my dad's mother's mother pieced these blocks in 1947, around 1947. This was the year that my uncle was born. My dad was born 2 years later in 49, and I believe my great-grandmother died like sometime pretty soon after my dad was born. So I think she got sick. She never finished this quilt, and she did not make one for my dad. So, but this was begun the way my grandmother tells it, or used to tell it. She's lost my grandmother as well, but the way my grandmother used to tell it was that her mother started this quilt for my uncle. I don't know if that's 100% true. It sounds good, but I do know that both of my great-grandmothers on my dad's side were avid quilters. I'll show you my other great-grandmother's quilt another day. She had a thing for Jacob's Ladder, so I've got at least 3 scrappy Jacob's Ladder quilts of hers. But anyway, this one, so my grandmother's name was Rosellen Corey Hardison, my great-grandmother. And so, again, she pieced these. My grandmother put it together, and best guess, my grandmother put this together in 1990 when I was in high school. I believe this coincided with sometime around the time my uncle actually had a heart attack, and he was doing okay. But I think my grandmother got this sense of, like, I don't know, needing to do things and complete things. So anyway, she said that these were originally pieced for my uncle and that she wanted to finish the quilt. So I'm pretty sure she did the sashing and then these cornerstones, which are like a pale pink. And my grandmother was very good about quilt history, because she actually I think she liked quilt history better than she liked quilting. To my knowledge, she never really pieced a full quilt. She did, she and her sister would quilt a lot. She quilted this, obviously. She quilted cheaters cloth quilts, which, you know, if you've probably seen them before. They're not just the kind of overall cheaters cloth, but they're actually printed with, you know, the blocks are printed already. She made, I think, 2 of those. One of them was for a wedding gift for me. And we used it very heavily for about 15 years, and then I packed it away because it needs some mending. I really need to get to that. But anyway, she was very good about labeling quilts. So, this one's probably all tied up with my chair, but you can see here that she embroidered the details about this quilt on here. And it says, pieced by Rosellen Hardison, 1947, quilted by Lola H. Capps, 1990, for Steve Capps. Now, how I came about having this quilt. My uncle, he never had children. He was never married. And he and I were fairly close, particularly once I was an adult. He was a flight attendant for many, many years, probably from the time I was little until he got sick. And he had a heart attack when I was like late in high school. And then he ended up having, I can't remember what the full name of it is, but it's basically like a blood cancer. And he ended up having to have a bone marrow transplant. And this is probably in the early 2000s. Well, 15 years later, he developed what's called graft versus host disease, which is kind of rare, but then I've heard of a lot of other people that have had it. And so what happened was, it's not the body rejecting the transplant, it's the transplant rejecting the body, basically. And so he got very sick, and he went through some multiple rounds of chemo. And the second round was like very, very harmful to him. And so I ended up going and living with him for a while to help him. And so one day he said, hey, go, in this closet, dig this thing out. And I'm like, are you talking about this quilt? Like, and of course my grandmother, he lived in my grandmother's house, and there were a bunch of quilts I knew eventually I was going to abscond with. Because, nobody else in the family really cares about him that much. But I pulled this quilt out, and I was like, I've never seen this quilt. And he's like, it is the ugliest quilt I have ever seen. And he made me promise that I wouldn't tell anybody in the family that I had the quilt until after he was dead, because he didn't want people coming after me and him, because this was pieced by my grandmother's mother. My grandmother had like 7 siblings, and they all, of course, had multiple children. And of course, everybody in the family would be clamoring for a Rose Ellen Hardison quilt. So anyway, I had to keep it a secret for a very long time. My uncle, unfortunately, did pass away, and I got the rest of the quilts. But anyway, this one to me, it remains special to me, because whether it was specifically made for my uncle or not, it is, I have like the provenance of the quilt. So, and I don't have a whole lot of that. I have a quilt that my grandmother made for my mom. It ended up being mine. I think I've told you guys about it as a Sunbonnet Sue. But I don't really have a whole lot of like family quilts. So this one is special. So that is what we are looking at today. All right. So my other show and tell for you is I'm wearing, for those of you that maybe like to cross mediums and knit, I am wearing my Sam Barsky t-shirt. And I will warn you, if you ever purchase a t-shirt from Sam Barsky, order at least 2 sizes bigger, because the fabric that they print these shirts on is terrible. It's a very polyester-y, sleazy kind of fabric. And the sizing is way off. But I am so enamored with Sam Barsky, I just had to show you guys. Let me go to his website. He is a Baltimore guy, but you might already know who he is. You may have already seen him. So this is his website, sambarsky.com. It's Barsky. And so he knits these sweaters, and he knits like a crazy person, like gets a sweater done a day kind of thing. And so he does not sell the sweaters themselves, but he sells the sweaters that are, or t-shirts that are made from the sweaters. And so they're these all over print sweaters. Hey Molly, yes. I started following him on Instagram, and he's pretty well known on Instagram. So anyway, these are the sweaters he has available for purchase, the prints of the sweaters. And he actually has quite a few of them. And I had a hard time deciding which one I wanted, because I have wanted one for a long time. So this is, I did human anatomy. So this is what it looks like. I'm not going to stand up because it does not fit my lower half very well. It's kind of obscene. This is the sort of shirt I'm going to have to wear under a sweatshirt or something. So anyway, but I just thought it was cool. I think that he has made this like, I don't know, internet presence for himself by making these sweaters, and he's been doing it for like 20 some years. And you know, every time he goes to a special place or goes to see something special, he makes a sweater. And I mean, I think at this point he's made like hundreds of them. And the great thing about him is most of them are short sleeved. And so, you know, you don't often see that. So essentially he's knitting t-shirts, and then he has them printed as t-shirts. So he's an interesting guy. And he also, I believe, will do, he's on Cameo. And so, like, if you want to wish somebody a happy birthday or happy anniversary, or, you know, any of the Jewish high holidays, like whatever event you want to like send somebody a greeting for, he will do it in a sweater that I'm assuming it's maybe of your choosing, but I think it's like he wears the happy birthday sweater for happy birthdays, and he wears, I don't know. I've never purchased one of his cameos. So anyway, yeah, so I just wanted to show you him. I always like to support other makers and their interesting things. So that's Sam Barsky. The other thing I want to tell you guys about is this. I finally finished making the form to submit a quilt for study, for our online quilt study. So if you weren't here when I first started talking about it, and I've kind of randomly talked about it here and there, but I love going to these regional quilt studies. I've now been to, I think, 3 of them. And I'm got another 2 coming up in the next couple months. One's a repeat, and the other one is one I couldn't go to earlier. But anyway, it's so fun. They're very informal. Everybody like brings a quilt based on whatever the theme for the quarter or the month or whatever. And basically just go around the table. You put your quilt out. Everybody oohs and ahs over it, points things out, asks questions, you know, date fabrics, all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, what's the next best thing to that? Certainly these in-person quilt studies are really fun because you get to touch the quilts and, you know, turn them and look at them, all that stuff. But what's the next best thing is like looking at them online, you know, and if you can get good pictures, you know, and I think for the most part, we generally all have, you know, phones with decent cameras on them that, you know, we're not looking necessarily for pictures that are like, what would you send to Quilt National to get accepted? Must show all 4 sides of the quilt. Like, we don't need to have that kind of stuff. But if you can get some good pictures of a quilt that you want to show off, and we can study it, and, you know, that's the next best thing, right? So anyway, this form is at, I'll put it here in it's bit.ly/quilt gossip. Here's my keyboard. bit.ly/quilt gossip. And why do I call it a quilt gossip? Because Dr. Dunton would have called it a quilt gossip. So basically you just need to come to the form, and you know, I've got a bunch of stuff here. What's your mission? Some stuff about photos, because I know sometimes people struggle with photos, and there are limits to how big photos can be and all that stuff. So, oh, Molly, buying more from Jill. Jill is such an enabler, isn't she? I haven't bought a quilt from Jill since maybe the holidays. Yeah. So anyway, and basically all of this, everything on the form is completely optional. Like if you don't want to reveal yourself, you know, you don't have to give me your name. Just give me your Twitch screen name, your email if you want to, you know, I mean, so that I can ask you questions, you know. But then just like, what's the name of your quilt? Describe the quilt. What's the history of the quilt? If you know it, how did you come to have it? What's your favorite thing? Anything that you want us to pay attention to. And then you have questions about the quilt that, you know, like maybe how old is it, or you know, how prevalent was this pattern, or who knows, whatever you have questions about. And then uploads. So I have one place to upload a full photo of the quilt, best as you can do. Again, we're not looking for like the stuff that quilt shows, you know, but just as long as it's good and like we can tell what's the pattern, like what's the overall pattern if it has an overall pattern. So, and then detail shots. And so detail shots could be like really anything. I mean, look on what people post on Instagram as far as detail shots. You know, a single block, so you could kind of show the construction. You know, things like, if it's labeled, you know, you could show that. You could show like what the binding looks like, because that's always interesting. How do people bind quilts? Is it, the back to the front? Is it the front to the back? Is it a separate piece of binding? Did they miter the corners? Like, there's so much you can look at with binding. An individual fabric that's really interesting. If there's damage on the quilt, how did they repair it? All that kind of stuff is like super interesting to look at. So those are just some suggestions. You could take pictures of whatever. So yeah, so it's out there. I think I said this earlier, was just like, submit quilts whenever. You know, like, I'm not going to have a deadline or anything. I'll give you guys, you know, if we're getting close to doing a stream, a quilt study stream, I'll let you know. But I would say, you know, if I get like 5 or 7 quilts, we'll do a quilt study, because I think that will at least take up an hour or more. And then, yeah, if everybody sends in a quilt, we can have multiple shows. So I don't know. I mean, everybody has mentioned that they have a quilt, so I don't know, you know, how interested or what kind of time people have to get pictures. So anyway, that is that. So let me go back here and let's see. You know, I moved things around, so now I'm like, I always had trouble centering myself. So now I have to be like all the way over at the side of my that's weird. Part of my furniture movement and moving some things around is that I want to be able to move over to my cutting table to have overhead cameras to show you guys more stuff, versus what you're going to see today, which is my old document camera, which you've seen before, and it's a hot mess, but we're doing our best here. So, all right, what was the other thing I wanted to tell you guys? Oh, I wanted to say hi to everybody. So, hello. My Stream Elements is working weirdly today. It gave the old title for some reason, which I absolutely know I saved the new title of this stream, and I don't know why. So, but Robin's here. Yay! How you doing, Robin? Druid, my darling Molly. So good to see you. By the way, Molly, yesterday was the Quiltside chat with Mary Fons and Carolyn Ducey, and Mary showed off a quilt from the International Quilt Museum. Well, let me back up. The premise of Quiltside chat is for whoever the subject is, whoever the person is, and it happened to be Mary Fons yesterday. The question is, if you could sneak away with a quilt from the International Quilt Museum to have for yourself or whatever, what quilt would it be and why? And so Carolyn Ducey is the sort of the host of it, and Mary, you know, explains to her why she wants that quilt. And Carolyn Ducey is oh, thank you for putting that in there, Molly. Yes, you can rewatch it if you did not get to see it live. Carolyn Ducey is the director, I can't remember, curator. Thank you. She's the curator of the IQM. So anyway, Mary talked about one of Bertha Mextroth's quilts that, and the IQM has a number of them. I think she said there's like 16 of them. So that was so wonderful yesterday, and Molly, great job, because Molly does the back end stuff of that. So, oh, and yes, Kate, Mary does make an announcement at the end of that video. So I don't know, do you guys want me to spoil it for you, or do you want to watch the video? It's an hour long, so I mean, I'm not gonna show it here, but yeah, I mean, it is public, but if you haven't seen the video, then you don't know. So, Quiltish, hi! Maro Dim, I know I saw you. Hello. And Kate who cooks, so glad you're here. Alright, so I'll spill the beans. So you don't have to watch it all the way to the end. Although please do, because it's a wonderful. But yes, she has chosen to go to University of Texas at Austin. And as you may know, the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History is down there, right there at the University of Texas at Austin, and it is an incredible resource for quilt studies. Joyce Gross, who, you know, she's one of those giants whose shoulders upon which we stand in terms of quilt study. Like all of her stuff is there, and just based on what I have looked at for Joyce Gross, and also I have contacted them to look at some of her content, and it didn't work out because they're just so busy. They're, if you make a request for something from their library archives, they're like months and months and months backed up. And so I ended up declining to wait that long when I was doing my Dr. Dutton research, with the plan to actually go down there at some point. Because they were like, you know what, you could come tomorrow, we'll pull it for you. But for us to pull it for you and get it copied and all that jazz, we're looking at like a 4-month wait. And they also have the opportunity, if you know somebody that can go in there for you, they'll also accept that. But at the time I was just like, oh, this is just too much. It was getting too close to me needing to give my Dr. Dutton lecture. So anyway, but the incredible, place. So I'm very excited for Mary that she's going to be doing her work there. She and Eric are getting a little place down there. And I think that kind of figured into her decision that Austin is much more affordable than Boston. Austin, more affordable than Boston. She looked at the Boston University program as well and just decided that she really liked the opportunities at Austin better. It was also, it's more affordable down there. I was really bummed she didn't choose George Washington University because that's so close to me, down in DC. But she said when she did her site visit there that she just did not get the great vibes that she got from Boston and Austin. So that's right, Marodim, you are in Texas. I gotta keep that in mind. How far are you from Austin? Are you in Austin? Can I get you to go to the Briscoe Center? Yes, the University of Texas gave her a full scholarship. I feel like they all contributed like money, like, I don't know that she was going to have to pay for really anything to do with her doctoral work. In fact, I think Boston University had an even better deal, but financially it kind of worked out to be like, well, it's cheaper to live in Austin. So even though like the full ride and whatever they pay you, the stipends, all that stuff, ends up being a little bit lower than Boston University. Boston is so much more expensive to live. It was like one of those decisions. I think she really had to, grapple between the two and figure it out. And hopefully I'm not like spilling all of her personal details, but I think this is kind of what she said anyway. So, yes, so we will have that in at University of Texas once Mary starts her work in the fall. So, okay, so day drive there. Okay, 5 hours. Okay. Well, if I go to Austin to visit Mary and get her to get me into the Briscoe Center, Martin, you will have to make that 5-hour drive. So, yeah, anyway, that was some exciting news. I knew as soon as I tuned in yesterday and she said, well, I have this big announcement at the end of the talk. I was like, she's going to tell everybody what she decided to do. So that was pretty exciting. But also, if you have not seen the Quiltside Chat, take an hour out and watch it, because I think what she gave, and any of you that actually went to her QuiltCon lecture on Bertha Meckstroth can tell me, but I think she gave kind of like an abridged version of that lecture. I could not go to her Bertha Meckstroth lecture at QuiltCon. I missed it because I had a conflict, although I did see her other one. But anyway, if you went to that one, I mean, you can tell me if it was different. But yeah, it's, and the thing is, Mary is so enthusiastic about Bertha that it wasn't just looking at this one particular quilt, but okay, Quilter says it was most of it. Yeah, I figured so, because a lot of this stuff she talked about, like I had kind of talked one-on-one with her about when she discovered it. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff about Bertha's will. And so I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it, but it's so interesting. And I remember when she got, she went down to the court place in Chicago, or it might have been a suburb, where she went and got that stuff, and she texted me like the day she got it and was like, look at this. So it was so exciting actually to see from the time she discovered it to her putting it into a presentation. So it was a lot of fun. So so your brother went to University of Texas. Awesome. Yeah. What was I looking? Oh, I think it might have been you, Martin, that said, was it the Botanical Center or something there somewhere in Texas where they have an example of a dugout? I keep thinking about that. I'm like, I'm going to go check that out. Okay. So what else did I have on my list here? Eli Leon. So while I was reorganizing yesterday, I have a huge stack of books that I need to do something with instead of keeping it in a huge stack. And this was in there. Who'd have thought it? This is Eli Leon. And he was a prolific collector of, yes, the Dallas Botanical Gardens, yes. He was a prolific collector of African-American quilts. And he put together this, he curated this show, Who'd Have Thought It? It was in 1988, I believe, at the San Francisco Folk Art Museum. Let me make sure I get this right. I hate it when they don't, I can't find that title page in there. Oh, here we go. So yes, this was at the San Francisco Craft and Folk Art Museum. And the show hung from December 31st of 1987 to February 28th of 1988. And this, well, by all intents and purposes, like the quilts that are in this book are, oh, I just opened it. That's Rosie Lee Tompkins. This one right there. You guys have seen that one before. Just an incredible look at, you know, these very improvisational quilts. And, I think he did a lot in terms of, you know, putting together these quilts, you know, as a group and putting them out there in the public eye, which is incredible. He had some questionable thoughts about these quilts, and about the women who made them. But he also made some interesting observations. And so I wanted to just kind of show this to you. This book is, because it's it's really a show catalog. It is not easy to find, and I lucked into a copy that did not make me have to like second mortgage my home, but I still paid a lot for this. So I would just caution you, if you go out there looking for it, don't be surprised, because it's not a cheap book, but it is a good book if this is a subject you're interested in. So I just wanted to read you a little bit of the beginning of this, because it's just interesting to me what people at this time were saying about these quilts. And because we're going to talk more about our good friend Raymond Dobard from Howard University. He pops up, and I hate to slam this man, because he was a scholar. He was a scholar of African-American quilts. But he pops up like a bad penny. And I will tell you what my opinion of some things he said are. But anyway, so this is kind of the introduction by Eli Leon, and it's long, so I'm only going to read a little bit of it. But he starts off by saying, improvisation in music, art, and dance is pervasive throughout Black Africa and is a prominent characteristic of African-American quilts. In the Afro-American tradition and decorative arts, folklorist John Michael, and I think it's Vlock, calls improvisation the basis of Afro-American creativity. Comparing African textiles to African-American quilts, he says, in both cases, there is a use of formal design motifs, but not a submission to them. There is a playful assertion of creativity and innovation over the redundancies of disciplined order. So, and then he kind of goes on to say that, you know, improvisational forms are very prominent in African-American quilting, but they do not always think about the fact that these improvisational forms are like, they're not necessarily seeking what these forms turn out to be. And what I found to be problematic about this is that indeed, even though there was this improvisation in these quilts, I think many of these quilters do say, you know, I kind of knew what it was going to turn out to be. I wasn't just pulling scraps out of a bag blindly. And also that there's this like talking out of both sides of their mouth kind of thing, like, oh, they were totally looking at all of these different types of, you know, symbology and imagery and cloth types that were coming out of Africa. So they're saying that on one hand. And then they're saying, like, they don't really realize they're doing that. And I'm like, wait a minute, no, you can't have it both ways. So I think what I think is important to say about these, unless you've got a you could talk to a quilter who says, this is why I made this quilt. I was referencing kente cloth, or I was referencing, you know, something that you know, I'd seen or was in my family, whatever. And also, I love the metaphor, not the direct comparison of, oh, hey, Kenny. Hello. The metaphor of improvisational quilting to jazz. I love that metaphor because it is, you know, when you think about the fundamentals of piecing a quilt's not going to work out if you're just like flinging fabric at itself, right? You do have to, I mean, there are fundamentals you have to sort of know. Like you have to make sure that it lays flat, right? It has to, you know, if it's going to fit on a bed, it has to be certain dimensions. Like, so there's all those kind of rules, but within those rules, then you can kind of riff how you want. And jazz music is kind of like that, you know, improvisational jazz. So I just think that that's a cool metaphor. And that's the kind of language that I wish Hidden in Plain View had sought, instead of this attitude of, if this is true, then couldn't this be true? You know, like it's all about tone. And I think I beat that horse dead the other day. But anyway, so there's just all that. And it's interesting. And I know I'm kind of coming at this from the perspective of, you know, 20 and 30 years down the line, you know, when all of this kind of stuff was happening and being, you know, being discussed and all that stuff. But it's funny how it keeps coming up. And we actually had a brief conversation the other day, several of us from American Quilt Study Group, Mia Clift, who is, you know, one of my colleagues with American Quilt Study Group. She does a lot of stuff on Facebook, and she had kind of put a conversation out there about Underground Railroad and quilt code and all that kind of stuff. And so I guess it comes up every year for Black History Month, and which I think is a shame that that's when we focus, you know, the quilt community decides to focus on this. We should talk about it all year round. And we should also really talk about what makes sense and what doesn't. And again, beat that horse dead here. I'm not going to really talk about that anymore, except for Raymond Dobard. So, Piece of My Soul, Quilts by Black Arkansans, and this is by my hero, Cuesta Benberry. Another wonderful quilt researcher that we lost too soon. I would do anything to be able to have met her. She was a Dr. Dunton fanatic. She was really into, she wanted to find like all the quilts that he had documented, and particularly the Baltimore album quilts. And she and Joyce Gross did a lot of discussion, and they had some of the letters that, you know, Dr. Dunton had sent to other people and stuff like that. So anyway, I absolutely love her. Raymond Dobard, he wrote a piece in this book, and I'm like, oh, Cuesta, really? So we're also going to look at Arkansas's quilts. And we've been looking at this book a little bit. I read to you the intro, which was by former Arkansas governor and former president Bill Clinton. And we flipped this a little bit, but I actually did my homework this weekend, as I said I would, and I went through and I marked all of the quilts that are similar between this book and this book, so we can look at them and see, you know, is there any difference? In some cases, there is not. It's interesting. So, both of these books are well researched. If this one is pretty easy to get, A Piece of My Soul. I don't know about this one because I didn't buy this one. This one was given to me, so I don't know. I haven't checked to see how hard this one is to find. But A Piece of My Soul is well worth it, just for the eye candy in here. There's only about half of it is quilts, but they are incredible quilts. These are, I'll just show you. Big, nearly full color pages. Now, granted, there's not a whole lot of detail shots in here. There's only a few, but there's still such good photographs that it's like forgivable that there's no detail shots. Now, what I can say about Cuesta Benberry, she very educated person. I believe, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe she was a librarian or had advanced education in library science. I'll put it that way. So, you know, she was a person that cared about the details. And so what I would say about her book is that it's very well researched, and it's the kind of stuff that we like to look at because it's well researched. I mean, I can't say anything more than that, you know. But where? Oh crud! Did I already lose my place in here? I was having a hard time marking some of these because I'm like, I need to make sure that I could quickly match this stuff up. Okay. So, like I said, Raymond Dobard. He is the co-author of Hidden in Plain View. Now, Cuesta Benberry did write an introduction or a forward piece to that book. And I'm just like, did she agree to write that before she actually read the book? Did she maybe not read the book? So he writes an introduction to this book. And, you know, I'm reading it and I'm like, okay, I'm going to redo this first paragraph because I think it's very good. But then I'm like, what? He references his own book multiple times in this introduction. And I'm like, I realize that people do this kind of stuff. They write intros for each other's books or they give reviews for books because, you know, that's how you play the game, right? How you get your name out there, because it's kind of, I mean, for lack of a better word, you know, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with it. This is how this works, and it's fine. But the fact that he like just references his own book multiple times to prove his point, I'm just like, ew, that's kind of gross. Because Cuesta Benberry has done research. She has the receipts for her research. Raymond Dobard and Jacqueline Tobin did not necessarily have the receipts, other than the ones that Ozella Williams gave them. And we don't know how accurate her receipts were. So let me read you this first paragraph, or some of it, because it's just like, all right, so this is called Introduction, A Patchwork of People and Patterns. And then there's this quote at the top. It's the Arkansas Black experience is varied, complex, sometimes tragic, sometimes joyous, and often at the heart of the American dream. And that is Tom Baskett Jr., and from a publication called Persistence of the Spirit, The Black Experience in Arkansas in 1986. So he must have been somebody, I didn't look up that book, but he must be somebody that was writing, on these topics at the same time that Cuesta Benberry was doing her research, and Raymond Dobard and Jackie Tobin wrote their book, etc. So he says, a piece of my soul is an American patchwork of quilts and biographies, skillfully pieced together by Cuesta Benberry into an exceptional exhibit and thought-provoking catalog. Through juxtaposing genealogical information, migration documentation, family histories, quilt patterns, and styles, Benberry makes it possible for the Black quilters of Arkansas to share pieces of their souls with all who see the exhibition and read this catalog. Variety enlivens this exhibition and proves that no one style of quilt is privileged as the quintessential African-American Arkansas model. And so on. So I just thought, how ironic that he gives such praise to Cuesta Benberry for genealogical information, migration documentation, family histories, whereas he put a bunch of work into a book where the only documentation was family history. All right, I'm going to stop poking at Raymond Dobard. Anyway, yes, I'm just flipping through here looking. Every time he mentions his book, it's in italics, so I can see, well, there's 3 mentions of it. All right, so let's look at the quilts, because they are both stunning in both of these books. But wait a minute, what year was, double T just fell. He just took a little dive. remind myself when this book was written. Okay, so this one's 1987. 87. And A Piece of My Soul is 2000. So this one is obviously published much later. See, Hidden in Plain View is 97, I think, 98. So that was a little bit closer to this book. So the Arkansas Quilts is much earlier. But the content, as far as the quilts themselves, are pretty consistently like the same span of like late 1800s to mid 20th century. Piece of My Soul actually has a few more contemporary quilts, some that were made in the 80s, I think. So, but anyway, as I first flipped through these, I was like, oh man, the quilts are so different, but they're not really. There's a lot of consistency between these two different communities in Arkansas. One thing I did note, and you know, you're sort of at the whim of the curation of these books, right? This one specifically was for a show that Cuesta Benberry curated. And this was specifically a documentation project. So they were at the whim of who brought what quilts with what history. And then, you know, they obviously picked the quilts that had like maybe the best history or were the, you know, maybe best looking quilts. I mean, there was probably lots of decisions that went into it. But the Arkansas Quilters Guild, again, they were kind of at the whim of who brought what quilts. But what I did notice was Piece of My Soul, a lot of log cabin and variations of log cabin and courthouse steps as well. Courthouse steps is very similar to log cabin. It's just instead of constructing it around, you construct it alternating sides, but it's the same technique. Whereas Arkansas Quilts, there was only 1 or 2 log cabins in here, and I think 1 courthouse steps. So I guess to the Arkansas Quilters Guild, people either did not have a whole lot of like good looking log cabins or log cabins that they wanted to show off, and maybe you know, there's many reasons why, just luck of the draw, coincidence, just, you know, the log cabin quilts didn't come out, or because log cabins are they can be a scrappy quilt, they can be very simple to make, they can be very difficult to make, they can be very striking if you choose a particular pattern, and that becomes difficult because you have to be very careful about how you set your log cabins, and we're going to look at this in a second. But also, if you just throw together a bunch of log cabin blocks, they can be very quick to make. And so I'm kind of wondering, you know, did the log cabin quilts, you know, in the history of this community, did they maybe get used up, or did they not make them, or did, you know, when people brought them to the quilts, you know, brought them to the quilt study, were they just not as interesting? Who knows? But in the African American tradition, we have lots of different versions. So let's look at all of that. I had such a good time looking through this. It was frustrating at first, I'll be honest, because as I was looking at these, I'm like, oh no, they're so different, and I kept flipping back and forth, but I very quickly found the consistency. So hopefully my little notations I've made for myself, I can find this stuff quickly. All right, so we are going to start with this gorgeous Texas Star quilt, or Lone Star, Star of Bethlehem. And so this is called Texas Star Quilt is what the name she gave it. Cordelia Allen Green of Camden, Arkansas. And this is circa 1920. It's 71 by 70 inches. And, you know, this particular pattern tends to work out well as a square quilt, right? We see these a lot. Hey, JB. Oh my goodness. Eye appointment. Well, this quilt itself is kind of glowing. I'm glad you're here. Sorry you had to have your eyes dilated. Hopefully it was just a, you know, nothing bad. Just a usual being blind, right? Now, let's look at the one in here. Now, very different in terms of color, right? Just getting old, huh? I get it. Same. Now, this one was interesting because what we know about this one, because you've got a documentation project, a state documentation project, people are encouraged to bring as much information as they can with a quilt. So this particular quilt, the information here, it says the quilt maker is unknown. And this quilt is 1867 to, 1867, so much earlier than the other one, this one. It's a little bit bigger, 79 by 79. It was from McNeil, Arkansas, Columbia County. The quilt maker is unknown, and this is why. The quilt maker should be known, but this quilt was made for Callie Thompson Reeves when she was 4 years old. So her father paid $4 to have the quilt top pieced. And then the quilt top was pieced in Amity, Arkansas. And then her son, George Earl Reeves, gave the quilt to his own daughter. So the quilt was pieced. We don't know anything about it getting quilted. So, yeah, it's a confusing story here, but it's just, you know, it's interesting. And I like the diamond border as well. This one, though, I mean, look how they did this. This was almost like a, I mean, I don't want to call it a log cabin, but it is like when you do this kind of thing, it is kind of a log cabin variation. So this one appeals to me more because of the colors, and what is showing up on my camera looks, or on my screens, looks like very pinkish, but these pink strips, what is showing here is these pink strips, those are actually more of like a purple. It's more of like a sort of a lilac-y, a pinky purple. So, but still very pretty. This is actually red, not orange. So sorry, my camera, my document camera sucks as far as color, but yeah, loved that one. Okay, so let's move on to, yeah. Like I said, not a whole lot of, use the duck to hold that open. Not a whole lot of log cabins. This one though, this setting of log cabins is scrappy, but because they did these, you know, large swaths of the same color, the way this gets set together is so gorgeous to me. It's so modern looking. So this one was also made by Cordelia Allen Green, same woman. 1940 though, so she's been quilting, I mean, however old she is, she's quilts over a number of years. And then it's this 87 by 64 inches. Now, let's see, let's look for the log cabin in this one. And I think, if I remember correctly, nope. Okay, this was one of those ones where I badly marked. Oh, it's green. Aha! Okay. So this is the one in here. Now, what they did here, you know, for those of you quilt nerds that caught, and I want to say it was sort of late last year, maybe in September, August, that Mary did a show where she looked at quilt styling for photographs. And if you ever tried to take a picture of a quilt, you know, quilt styling is difficult. Just getting a flat view, you know, these kind of flat views of quilts is difficult. Whoever did the photography for this particular book did a really good job. They had whatever kind of setup, they could take nice flat pictures. A few years prior, you know, they got some really great flat pictures, but then they also got these shots. And if you flip through this book, you see every right-hand page is this stuff, which is great when they have the quilt itself on the facing page laid flat, which in this book there are some of those, but in other cases, no. They just have this style shot, and so it's irritating because something like this is I want to say this might be streak of light. I don't know. I can't tell. Dark and light. I can't tell. It's hard because, you know, you can kind of guess based on like what you see here, but without it being flat, you can't exactly tell what's happening. So that was irritating. But what we know about this one, log cabin, 1880. This one, 1940. It's 69 by 81. And the quilt maker was just a member of the Patton family. So, you know, I want to say that happens a lot. You end up with a quilt, and down through the years, you know, somebody in your family made it, but you don't know, you know, it's one of, the, you know, these 4 sisters or something like that. So I would say that's probably what this family ran into. Okay. Next. This is a very interesting one. And let me hold this one up because my document camera is not doing this one any justice. Let me flip back just for a minute because this quilt is so amazing. It's, again, so modern looking. So look at this beauty. There is some, you know, really technical piecing in there with those, I don't know what you call those these shapes. I don't know what you call this. The title given to it in the book is Snowflake Quilt, made by Hattie Williams Jones of Falk, Arkansas, circa 1945 to 1960. And my guess is they're probably assuming that based on the fabrics that are in it, that would span that time period, unless they know for certain that, you know, that she worked on this quilt during those years. I think a lot of times when those kind of date ranges are given, it's because you just don't know, you know, when somebody exactly made the quilt, and you have to go by the fabrics. Now, look at this one. Same thing. This is called Crazy Star or Arkansas Snowflake. And I'm wondering, because in this book it's being called Arkansas Snowflake, that this might be something that was made a lot in Arkansas. You know, we see that regional quilt styles. Not to say this was never made anywhere else, but, you know, people, they're, you know, neighbors and friends, they kind of get the, you know, the itch to make a quilt that's just like somebody else made that they like. So it makes sense to me that this could have been in both communities in Arkansas a very popular quilt design. This is another one where, you know, the picture is not very well lit, and let me go back here just real quick so you can see this one. The colors are a little bit better in this, but I have to say, if I had to pick between this one and the one that's in Cuesta's book, I'd have to pick the one in Cuesta's book, because I mean, this is my jam. Very scrappy. You know, it's they're broken up with these columns versus, you know, just this very calm, sedate version. It's just not as interesting to me. And I mean, no shade. This quilt genuinely probably took a very long time and was very carefully constructed. I mean, we don't have a close-up of it, but we can see, like, the points look like they meet up, and this is just very, very, yeah, you know, JB, I think that looking at this one, I think it is a drunkard's path. And, you know, again, unfortunately, there just is not a super picture of this one, but I think that's what it is. So if you isolate the little crazy star, it probably gets cut into quarters, and that's your little block in there. We might be able to see it better on this one. So you can see, like, if you break that out, I don't know if my big fat fingers are helping, but you can see, like, that curve there. Now, here we've got this going on, so that kind of tells us a little bit. The glare on there. So that kind of tells us that this particular piece right here is maybe pieced of 4 drunkard's path blocks, with the curved piece, you know, the convex pieces to the outer corners and the concave pieces to the inside. So yeah, I think that's probably what it is. Let me go back to, yeah, okay. All right, what is next? Ah, who doesn't love a grandmother's flower garden? Now this one is, I would absolutely love to have this one because it is a polyester double knit. Um, and I am an absolute sucker for the polyester double knit quilts. So this one is a flower garden quilt made by Hattie Williams Jones. And so I think she's the same one that just made this other one we looked at. Circa 1970, which makes sense for the polyester. It's 93 by 72 and a quarter inches, and it's polyester, like I said. So gorgeous thing. And look, so she's got the top of it is got a little sashing, and the hexes are cut in a way so that the top can be straight across. But she took advantage at the bottom of the fact that the hexes, make this like natural corner piece. And so you can imagine that how that falls on the bed. It falls on the bed with this nice graceful sort of scoop around the edge. And you see that like in tester quilts and, on the fancy beds. Okay, what is my... And then here we have a more traditional... this glare from above is not good. Let's see if I can fix that. Oh, that's maybe a little better. Okay. So then this is the more traditional looking grandmother's flower garden. And I think there might be, did I have another one in here? Maybe not. Yeah, I think there's a couple of grandmother flower gardens in this book, but this was the one I picked out as what I thought was the really pretty one. Oh, another thing that this book has a lot of that Cuesta Benberry's doesn't are the Carolina lilies. Carolina lilies must have been so popular in Arkansas because there's a lot of this showing up, and we don't see that in the Black Arkansans book. Also, there's some applique in here that we do not see at all. I could not find any applique quilts in Cuesta's, and maybe that was by choice. Maybe she just didn't have applique quilts to pick from, or also applique was maybe just not as prevalent and popular in quilts by Black Arkansans. We don't know. Let's see. Next one. So this is a 9-patch. This is also made by Hattie Williams Jones, and this one's circa 1980. Oh, and you know what? I didn't give you the dates on this one. So this grandmother's flower garden, this is 1920, 66 by 75 inches, and the quilt maker is Anna Youngblood, and it's owned or was owned by Stephanie Campbell. She's the great granddaughter. So, and then I'm assuming, no, this might be the lady that goes with this one. Yeah, I think this lady goes with this one. And so what was the date? Did we say the date on this one? Yeah, 1970. That's right, because it was polyester. So this one also polyester double knit. So and also think about polyester double knit is that it retains its color. You're not going to see faded polyester no matter how many times you wash it. It's always going to look this bright, colorful. Now it'll shred, it'll run like a pair of stockings, but if it gets a pick or a hole in it, but you're always going to have these beautiful bright colors. Let me find that one. This is a double 9-patch, and this is the one of just a couple of instances where they did the staged shot, and then they actually had the quilt itself. So now, granted, these are two different settings or two different applications of a 9-patch, and in fact, I think this one might fall into like Irish chain territory a little bit. Although it doesn't really have the diagonal aspect of an Irish chain. But in any event, the way this one goes together, the colors in this one are, much different than the colors in this other one. But think there's like almost 100 years in between them. So this double 9-patch is 1888, 70 by 90 inches. Unknown quilt maker, but it belonged to Glenda and Larry Harvey of Paragould, Arkansas. Whereas this one, I think I said 1980, 94 by 77 inches. So they're really close in size. But just, I mean, could not look different, right? I mean, look at these together. But they're both using 9 patches. This one they're sashed. This one they're alternated with the blocks. Now we have a courthouse steps. And like I said, if you're not a quilt maker, this one is very similar to the log cabin quilt, except with log cabin you add your strips around in either, I mean, you can either go counterclockwise or clockwise, but with a courthouse steps you're only adding them on one side at a time. So you add the 2 strips this way, and then you turn it and you add the 2 strips this way, and then this way, and so on. And so that's how it makes this stepped pattern. And our courthouse steps in this book looks like this. And let's see, so this one was made by Tilly Ray Williams Hall and her twin sister Willie Mae Williams Smith. Tilly and Willie. I wonder how often they wanted to like yell at their mother for that. So this was made circa mid 1930s, 81 by 74 3/4 inches. And of course it's tied with red yarn. Whereas this one is made circa 1920. So this one's just all about 10 years earlier. 67 by 74 inches. And unknown quilt maker, owned by Kathy Sullivan of Helena, Arkansas. Now this says, there's just this note: the black typically denotes judges' robes. I've never heard of that before, but I guess if we're talking about courthouse steps, then yeah, the black could be the judge. That could be the judge there in that little. And this one's an interesting setting because the beginning of it has like, it's almost like a snowball. The beginning of it, you know, should start with a square, but in this case it's a black square that then has had corners added to it that are white. Then they started with the courthouse setting. So that's interesting. I've never seen it referred to that way, and I don't know that I've necessarily seen that exact same center. Now with log cabin quilts, of course, we know that often the center is red. Like that's the traditional version of the log cabin. And it's supposed to denote like the fireplace or the hearth of the home. You know, one of those quilts. What do we call those? Like the quilt anecdotes that may or may not ever be true. All right, so one thing I saw very consistent between both sets of quilts are star quilts. Lots and lots of star quilts. So the Star of Bethlehem, the Lone Star, and these individual smaller stars. So I really kind of randomly picked like, so this one is Lemoyne Star, Star of Lemoyne, and it's made by Frances Smith Wilson, circa mid 30s. Oh, and one thing, I'll read it, hopefully we'll have time. I'll read Cuesta's introduction to this book. I should have read that earlier. She went to the Old State House Museum and then was invited to curate this show. So a lot of these quilts actually come out of their collection at the Old State House Museum, which sounds like a really awesome museum. And I would very much like to go there sometime to see, you know, what they have. So we've got this, and then we've got this. Again, unfortunately, they decided to go with the style shot. But this one is called 8-Point Star, 1888. We don't know the maker. And this just says double size. It doesn't actually give the dimensions. So it fits a double-sized, a double bed. And this note just says, this is a scrap quilt. And this is owned by Glenda and Larry Harvey of Paragould, Kansas. So, or I'm sorry, Paragould, Arkansas. So, sounds like they might have had a number of quilts. They might have been quilt collectors. So, but I mean, look at these together. I mean, they're both 8-pointed stars, and they certainly are very similar looking, but also different. All right, what we got next? Oops, not this book. This one's easier. Okay. Butterflies. Okay. Butterflies were very popular in the early 20th century. So this one is a butterfly quilt made by Autherine William Anderson, circa 1930s. And this one does not give dimensions, but look how pretty, right? And then we also have some very pretty, there's actually 2 butterfly quilts in this book. So this one, about the same time, 1930s, 1936, and the quilt maker was Gail Hinton. And it says, Mrs. Hinton grew up on a farm near Brockwell, having several tops that had never been quilted. She decided to give her 2 nieces and nephews a top. This is the top she gave to her niece, and it was quilted by her niece's mother. So that. And it's, you know, it's interesting. These are more sort of subdued. But there's use of similar prints. You know, these, let me hold this one up a little bit. You can see like some of these little, you know, they're not super small prints. They're probably like dress prints. They're like these kind of prints, kind of like in my quilt. These use kind of those same prints. But the way that this one sets this, like, I don't know, this inner piece into the butterflies really makes it look different. And both of them used a black fabric, or maybe, I mean, this could be embroidery, but I suspect it's a strip of black fabric. They both used the black fabric for the butterflies' bodies. And then this one has another butterfly, I believe. Yeah. This one is really stunning. And I think very recently I did a screenshot of this particular butterfly. I think this is probably, let's see, this one says 1935, 86 by 72 and a quarter. I'm sorry, 86 by 72 and a half. The quilt maker is Josephine McClellan Crank. And it says this quilt was made for the owner's first cousin who died at a young age. The owner is the granddaughter of the quilt maker. But what I think this one was a newspaper quilt. Just based on what I'm remembering of seeing. And it's the way that you piece the body of the butterfly. It almost makes it like a, not exactly a double wedding ring piece, but sort of. It's like they're almost like a fan, if that makes sense. It's like a fan. So anyway, very different looking, right? You have these 3 different butterfly quilts that all have different aspects to them, different look and feel. I did not look for a quilt that looked just like this, but I mean, look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? The fabric that was used and just the way that it was set against these blue stars. Oh, absolutely gorgeous. Okay. So this one is, it says American Tree Quilt, made by Herma Wilson Williams of Magnolia, Arkansas, circa 1940. 79.5 by 64 inches. So I know this is a pine tree, but they've called it the American tree. Now, let's see. This is another one where I know, yeah, annoying. You can't see the whole thing, but you can get enough of it. And I mean, it is not the same pattern. It's pretty close though. You can see this one, the trunk is handled a little bit differently than this one, but it's still using the same type of, like, sort of a bow tie block, I guess, that, you know, the 2 little triangles, and then they expand out. So in this book, the details are 1886, so 1886, 1940. 62 by 74 inches. And this one is also owned by Glenda and Larry Harvey. And so I suspect they were collectors. That a bunch of their quilts ended up in here. And it's interesting, like I said, you know, there's a lot of quilts in these two books that are the same time period, but this book has a lot more antique quilts in it than this one. This one has more 20th century. And it, you know, maybe had a lot to do with, I'm sure it had a lot to do with condition and so on. Let's see. Ooh, double wedding ring. One of my favorites. Now, this double wedding ring, I just love. Just the color combination are just my favorite. So this says double wedding ring quilt made by S.E. Jackson, Magnolia, Arkansas, circa 1950. 85 by 69 and a half. And our double wedding ring in here. And I want to see, there's a couple of double wedding rings in here. This one also has pickle dish. This book has a number of pickle dish quilts. Now, pickle dish is very similar to double wedding ring, except it uses like some sort of jaggedy triangle shapes in it just to make it more difficult. So this one, almost, I mean, it's almost like some of the same colors. You know, you've got this like kind of dark, what I'm guessing it might be like a dark green or a dark blue, whereas this one has this sort of, you know, dark cadet blue. You've got lots of pink and green in here, like a pale green. You've got lots of pink in here. You know, they're utilizing really this almost, not, I don't want to say almost the same, but a very similar color palette. Now, of course, the years are only 20 years difference. So this quilt, 1950s, this quilt, 1930s. So let me read you. There's a little bit of a blurb about the lady that made this quilt. So 1930s. I'll put it back on the screen so you can watch it live. So 1930s, 72 by 83. So the dimension is just different. They're probably about the same size, but the dimension's different. The quilt maker is Maureen, and this is an interesting spelling, M-A-R-E-A-N, but I'm assuming that's Maureen Pearson. So it says Maureen Patterson Pearson was born and reared in Oxford, Arkansas. Under the training of her mother, Belle Patterson, she took to piecing and quilting at an early age. Both of them, during the early 30s, turned out a number of quilts, some practical, some fancy. Oh, you know why we have all of this information? Because Maureen is still alive at the time this book was written. She is the current owner of this quilt at the time this book is written. Let's see. Several of them are still in her possession and are generally in good condition. Maureen had a notable career in banking, being employed by the Bank of Melbourne. She was a member of the board of directors and cashier at the bank. After 10 years, she took a position with Citizens Bank of Batesville when it was organized in 1953. When she retired, she was assistant executive vice president. She now resides with her husband, Borden Pearson, at Batesville, Arkansas. So, you know, if you're going to shout about your awesome career, what a better place to do that than in a book that's showing a quilt you made. No shade to Maureen. I would do it too. Okay. Oh. So this is this amazing yo-yo quilt. And then this is one of the quilts where we do have a detail. You can see very pretty yo-yos. So this one was made by Malsey Shed Bennett, Camden, Arkansas, circa 1920. It says a novelty type of construction that was made as a bed cover, but does not conform to the traditional definition of a 3-layered quilt, which is true. This is more of like a coverlet or a bed covering or decorative item. It is not necessarily a quilt. Now look at this one. These remind me of granny squares. I guess what you would say is this is a yo-yo quilt that is put together like a log cabin or like a granny square. And I don't think, yeah, we don't have a close-up of this, but you know, from a distance, you would almost think that each of those little diamonds was a quilt block or quilt piece, but it's actually the spaces in between. Now this one, 1930, so about 10 years after the other one. Quilt maker is Mrs. R.L. Seiler. And this says, while technically not a quilt, this is a fine example of the technique known as yo-yo, popular with quilt makers in the 30s. And also the 20s, according to this quilt. Wherein circles of fabric are gathered along the edge and then joined together. They have one layer, no stuffing or backing. The black points in the picture are the open spaces between the circles. So yeah, they acknowledge that from this picture, it's hard to tell what's going on here. But how interesting, the setting. Again, look at this. You've got this solid block of pink and then this other solid area of purple that kind of just goes up. And then you've got these borders that are very scrappy, and then the center that's very scrappy. And in here you have these multiple oh, Robin, yeah, it's not spelled the same. It's R.L. Seiler, but it's S-Y-L-A-R. So I'm wondering, I mean, obviously different spellings, but somewhere along the line, I'm sure they were probably from the same place or same, I don't know what you call it, like whatever Seiler is in the old country. Purple yo-yos look like where the bed edge would be. Yes, this, yeah, I agree. I think this is the hang, you know, the fall or the hang that hangs over the edges. And then this is meant to be like a sort of a center medallion. Whereas this one, you know, doesn't have that. But yeah, I would be curious. I would love to see these two side by side just to see, like, I suspect that the yo-yos in this one are a little bit smaller than these. These are larger yo-yos, but who knows? Yeah. Okay. Okay. This one, there's a number of these kind of quilts in both of these. So this one is called a buzzsaw quilt. And it is, you can see, is because of, it looks like a buzzsaw, a saw blade. This one also has these little doodads in the corners that look almost like a duck foot. So this one says buzzsaw quilt made by Docella Johnson of Bradley, Arkansas, circa 1900 to 1920. Ah, yes, Mardum. Yeah. Oh, are you working on yo-yos from your pile of family treasures? I always like to check in your Instagram and see what you've done lately. So this one is 79 by 76 and a half. And this is a rising sun quilt. And the reason I put these together is, you know, I'm kind of addressing them together, is they look strikingly the same. So they're just different names that have been given. So this one was made by Beulah Smith of Paragould, Arkansas, 1924, 80 by 70 inches. So two very similar quilts. Now in this book, this they're calling a sawtooth circle saw. This one is by, let's see, 1880. So these are early 1900s, right? 1924 and 1900 to 1920. This one's 1880. 68 by 80. Quilt maker is Hannah Barger Ross. And it says Hannah Barger Ross, born 1815, died 1887. So she was fairly old when she made this quilt. Made this quilt for her grandson, William Samuel Warnock, born 1875, died 1953. The quilt has remained in the Warnock family. So, yeah, so the great-granddaughter. Oh, not from them. Oh, okay. Mauve and maroon remnants. Ooh, marooned. I like it. Well, I look forward to that. Yeah, yo-yos are one of those. I have a love-hate relationship with yo-yos because they're so satisfying. They're like hexies. You know, when you have like a big box of them that you've just been working on and working on and working on. And it is a great project for traveling because it's, you know, all hand done. But they're more difficult than a hexie because you have to turn down the edge. And I actually I don't know, Martin, if you have one of the yo-yo makers from Clover. I have the set of them, and they're very helpful. But it still takes forever because you got to baste the whole thing, and then you take it apart, and then you got to, you know, pull it and all that jazz. I like instant gratification, and it takes too long to make those. Okay, so, and then did I have another one? I think there's a couple of them in here, and I think I only, yeah, there was only the one quilt that was so similar to these two. But then you could see also, you know, this one different, but also this circular kind of thing. I think this would be constructed very similarly to how a Lone Star quilt is constructed. Okay. Next. All right, so Dresden plates. So this one, what you would expect from a Dresden plate, right? This one, the tips are pointy, and it depends on how you cut them, and then also how you put them together. I have seen where these are cut flat across the top, so you've just got this big narrow wedge, and it's flat across the top. And then that top part, instead of just being folded under, is folded like a point. And I can't tell you that's how these particularly were made, but it's a good chance that they were done that way. Because it's kind of a quick way to finish that top off just by stitching it into that shape. Now let's see, let me find in this book. How different. So first of all, this one has that ice cream cone border, which is difficult to see because they had to stage this one. But that's what that is called. I was last years old when I found out about that. But it's this kind of wedgy shaped, sort of pointy. It's called an ice cream cone, and it's typically a border treatment. These also seem to have something in the center. Oh, I didn't read this earlier. Okay, so this says Dresden plate, 1935, 73 by 90. Quilt maker unknown. That's a shame. But every block has a kitty appliqued in the center in broderie purse style. Now, why could they have not given us a detail of that? So, because I mean, you can't see what that is. It just looks like I mean, honestly, if I had to guess, I would have thought they were buttons or something. So what a shame that, I mean, this is where I get annoyed when I look at quilt books. It's like, I want a detail of that. If you're going to reference something, show it to me. So what a bummer. But these kind of fabrics are, let's see, 1935, maybe feed sacks are starting to come into the picture, but I think that these are just kind of like the conversation prints of the time. Whereas this one also was probably dress, dress fabrics and conversation prints. So, and I don't think I didn't give the details about this one. This one says fancy Dresden plate quilt made by Leonia Taylor, circa 1920 to 1930. So, exact same time period. And yes, I too feel cheated. Okay, basket quilt. Now, here's an example of bless Lula Bradford, James, flower basket quilt made by Lula Bradford James, Doddridge, Arkansas, circa 1930. Unusual use of ruching on the quilt. And methinks that this ruching is what resulted in this quilt refusing to hang straight. And all I could figure out what they mean by ruching is up here around the handle. I don't know. I mean, I'll be honest, I think that it's not really use of ruching, which ruching would be like gathering something to make it like, you know, a little decorative thing. It's usually multiple lines of, not just a single gather, but multiple lines of gathering. I suspect either this quilt shrank or I don't know. I just feel like this quote unquote unusual use of ruching is not really what was going on here. Exactly, quiltish. I feel like maybe this was a fabric that shrunk. Like maybe it was this, I don't know, this sort of golden brownish, like tannish colored fabric maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyway. So then there's a number of basket quilts in this here and this one. So here we've got this basket quilt. And this one pretty similar in terms of how, you know, they're both sashed with cornerstones. And then got this. Yeah. Looks like late 1800s decorative ruching, like used in drawing. Yeah, see, I mean, that's the thing. I don't know. I mean, was it intentional or not? We really don't know. I mean, you know, sometimes people do something and it just doesn't turn out. And that maybe that's what this was. But, you know, I go back to the fact that I feel like maybe this quilt was not super lie flat. And then there was some shrinkage that resulted in this sort of contorted situation. The colors are great, though. I really love the colors in this one. Likewise, this one. You know, they're just very pleasing color palettes. Now, whoops. Let's look at two other basket quilts that are in this, or one other basket quilt. This one, very different. This one's got this interesting sort of black part down here at the bottom. This one is completely black. You know, this one says to me, I don't know. Well, let's read what they said about it. Basket. Quilt maker was Pearl Seals Faulkner. And this is 1897. Whereas this one is 1930. So maybe I was confused when I said that there was consistency in the dates of these quilts. I think maybe there isn't. So Pearl Seals Faulkner. When Pearl was 10 years old, her grandmother, Elizabeth Thompson Hughes, visited her family and brought Pearl a thimble, needles, and thread. Pearl went to her mother's scrap basket and took some of the scraps to the corn crib and secretly began this quilt top. I love that. She's a sneaky little, like, corn crib quilter. Before it was finished, her mother discovered what she was doing and brought the project into the house, and under her supervision, this quilt was finished by the 10-year-old Pearl. That is precious. A 10-year-old made this quilt with the help of her mother. And I mean, look at this. You can see there's Baptist fan quilting along the border. The rest of it appears to be sort of some straight line quilting that just kind of goes around the basket, like straight line, and then the borders there, the sashing is straight line. But really, for a 10-year-old and her mom, that's a pretty decent quilt, I gotta say. So, but all of them sashing cornerstones, all of these basket quilts, but so different, you know, and especially this one, the color scheme. But also you can see she's pulling fabric out of her mother's scrap basket, and so we're talking, let's see, circa 1897, these would have been dress scraps. So it makes sense that a lot of them are sort of dark or sort of just a neutral tone. Whereas to me, now this could be a scrappy quilt, but also I see there's been this careful decision making about, you know, how the pieced triangles come together in the colors. So, you know, yellow is with like a lighter yellow, pink, the pinks are together, the blues are together, and the greens are together. So two very different kinds of like expertise and care. Okay. This might be one of my favorite quilts of all time, simply because it is so ridiculous. And that would be Giddy Up. Now, this is there's a whole story. Cuesta Benberry actually talks about this particular pattern. It was a well-known pattern that was published. Originally, there was an elephant pattern published for Ararat, and that was the name of the elephant. And very quickly, I want to say it was during some political times, probably an election year or whatever, they started referring to this, or women that were, and I mean, this is right around the time women got the right to vote. So it would have been the 20s and 30s. This elephant quilt, people were referring to it as the GOP elephant, right? So we do know at the early 20th century, the elephant and the donkey had already been assigned to Democrat and Republican parties. So with this elephant, and I don't think that the release of the elephant pattern was intended to be used that way, but that's how it became to be used, was as a, you know, I'm sure people made the elephant quilt just as an elephant quilt, but it was also being referred to as this GOP elephant. So somewhere along the line, somebody published Giddy Up, and Giddy Up was a newspaper quilt as well. And it is spelled Giddap, and I've heard it pronounced Gidap, but it makes sense if you say GID-D-AP, Giddy Up. That's my guess. So anyway, this one I love because it's only 4. I'm thinking that this quilt maker sized it up because I does not give the dimensions of this quilt, but I'm suspecting it's big enough for a bed, maybe a small bed, but still, I think even if it's baby quilt size, I think it would still size it up. And then you've got these pieces on the edge that I don't know if they were made to square up the quilt, if there was an intention to, if it was just the scraps from piecing the donkeys, I don't know. But I just love that, how these have been added to the edge, and it frames it nicely. Now, let us behold this Giddy Up. Now this one, either this is a very small quilt and this is a bed size quilt and they're the same size, or like I said, this one's been sized up. Now you can see the differences. Let me see if I can pull these both in here. So you can see the saddle, what we presume to be a saddle, the way this quilt maker has made it, all the same color, black. This quilt maker made it so that it's this yellow color on the body, and then I guess what would be what they call it, the horn on the saddle is a different color. So just that tiny little choice sort of made some changes. But I think just about everything else appears to be the same, except the toes on the front feet of the donkeys are pointing backwards in this quilt, whereas the toes in this donkey are pointing frontwards. And to me, that speaks design choice, because it's done on all 4 of them. Or she pieced the first one, went, crap, I made a mistake, let me just do the rest that way. Sometimes that happens too. So, it could have been a decision. It could have been I made a mistake, I'm going to do the rest of them that way. Who knows? But it looks nice to me. I'm trying to think, were there any other... So I've seen multiple versions of this quilt made, and I've seen the mistakes with the feet. And also sometimes just because of the way all of these little triangles, I've seen weird stuff with the triangles too. I feel like in the design, I feel like they could have done, whoever designed this could have made this more interesting with more of the half square triangles. I feel like they made it unnecessarily difficult by only having these half square triangles like pop up in certain areas. I feel like if they had maybe met I don't don't know what I'm saying. I feel like they probably could have made it a little bit easier. I feel like it with these sort of random pieces, it just makes it more difficult in where, you know, you place them. They're easy to turn around, I guess is what I'm saying, because it's a half square triangle. So one other thing that's interesting is the eye of the donkey in this one is, I'm assuming by the pattern, it's the top part of the half square triangle is gold, and then the bottom part is white. This one, the eyes are done differently. The eyes are done almost like they look like they're appliqued on. And to me, they look more natural, even though the body is kind of angled. This is a more natural looking donkey. But just how interesting, right? I was so excited as I was flipping through it. I'm like, there's a giddy up in both of these books. All right, so I think I have one more. And that is the churn dash. And to remind you, this is also a churn dash behind me. And you know what? Did I actually say who the giddy up was? So this giddy up is a very democratic donkey quilt made by Beatrice Ruth Calhoun Williamson of Texarkana, Arkansas, 1932 to 1934. This giddy up is made by Elizabeth Dixon Jenkins of Greensboro, Craighead County, Arkansas. So this is 1930, and let's see what the size is. Okay, so this one we don't have a size on it. This one, the size is 72 by 84. And it says that she lived a very short life, only 17 years, yet touched many lives. Not only was she a beautiful person, she did beautiful needlework. This quilt was made by her while she was a teenager. So, interesting. A girl who wasn't old enough to vote. You know, wonder what was her decision in making Giddy Up? Was it just because she liked donkeys? Or thought it was cute? I don't know. You know, I mean, that's a good question. If a 17-year-old girl made it, she probably wasn't making a political statement. Or maybe she was. Who knows? I mean, I don't want to take that away from her if she was very, you know, interested in political statements. All right. So back to the churn dash. Now, you may also recognize this particular quilt or this particular block as the monkey wrench. And I think that if you've ever seen a monkey wrench that's used in plumbing, you know that it has jaws that when like if you imagine the handle and you screw the handle, the jaws come together, right? That is why I think this is sometimes referred to as a monkey wrench, because of that aspect, that little, it's like jaws coming together. But I more often see this called churn dash. And I don't know what churn dash refers to, but it's interesting because if you will remember back to Hidden in Plain View, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about it again, but I do want to mention that they called this monkey wrench. And they went into a whole thing about how the monkey wrench was a person and how probably referred to as a blacksmith and yada, yada, yada. Well, historically, this block is not even known as a monkey wrench. I don't know when the term monkey wrench was given to it. It may have been a regional name. And, maybe that's something to research or not. I don't know. But my point about this is churn dash. Okay. The dash is the plus shape bit at the end of the stick that turns your butter. Okay. So it's just shaped like that thing. That makes sense. Yeah. Oh, a churn dash class for Mary Fawns. I have never actually taken a class for Mary. I've, other than, I guess, the finishing school, that one I did, the online one with Mary and Marianne. But, like a one-on-one class with Mary, never done that. This block is a barn door. Okay. Well, what I can say is in both of these quilts, it is called a churn dash. And I always knew this as a churn dash. And I believe that's what my grandmother called this, as a churn dash. So This one is a miniature quilt. It does not give the dimensions, but I mean, miniature quilt we know is, you know, give or take. So this is by Gloria Scott, Hot Springs, Arkansas, circa 1980. So there's a number of small quilts in here that are newer. So 1980. This one, 1920. And this one, unknown maker, 66 by 92 inches. And it says, photographed in a bathroom at the home of Reba Lawrence atop Crystal Hill in North Little Rock. This blue and white churn dash quilt was purchased in Arkansas. Good to know. It was photographed in the bathroom. I have to give him credit. This looks like a big, I don't know if it's a big wash basin or one of those like copper tubs. I'm not sure. They don't show enough of it to be able to tell, but yeah, it's up on this chair. But what I thought was really interesting was how similar they are in that they're both blue. Gloria Scott has used what look like, I mean, this is 80s, but looks like she's used these sort of, if they're not actual reproductions, and I suspect well, I mean, they could be vintage fabric. It just says cotton. But, I mean, they could be vintage fabrics or antique fabrics. They could be reproduction fabrics. In this one, 1920s, you know, these are very turn-of-the-century fabrics. And I realize that this is not as great of a picture, but like this one right here is a print that looks very, best as I can tell, very turn-of-the-century. So I just thought that was so interesting. Like, you've got these quilts that are separated by 60 years, but the blocks by themselves, you know, obviously the arms are fatter on this one and these are thinner, but you could put them side by side and just be like, oh, same. Right? Yeah. So I think that is it for this. Yeah. So interesting look, right? What do you guys think? You know, I would say the quilts in this particular book, Cuesta Benberry's book, they're pretty bright. There's a lot of them that, you know, look like they've been very well preserved. Really bright colors. We often hear that as, you know, kind of I don't want to say identification, but kind of a standard for African American quilts, is that they're bright colored, they're improvisational, yada yada, right? And we do see a lot of that in Cuesta's book. I'm just doing a quick flip through because there's so much in this one that we just haven't had a chance to look at. There's so many beautiful quilts in here. So I want to read to you. I mentioned it before, but let me switch back to me. You know what, by the way, I think I'd mentioned the other day that I was watching Mama Is a Fan, our new friend, on her channel, and she does more like, you know, she's showing how to make quilty things. Like she did binding the other day. She's done quarter square triangles. But she has this cool setup where it's a voice activated camera situation. So she'll be like, you know, zoom overhead and it just goes whoop. I am so jealous of that. I actually have to push buttons. So I wanted to read just the preface of this book, and it's fairly short, by Cuesta, because this kind of explains why she wrote this book. Because originally, when I knew very little about Cuesta, I was kind of like, oh, she must be from Arkansas. And so she wrote this book, you know, as an homage to the other quilters of Arkansas. Cuesta was not a prolific quilter. She did make a few quilts, I believe, but she was really more a quilt researcher. And I mean, like, rabid quilt researcher. She makes the rest of us look really bad. Let's see. She tells it to focus on the iron or whatever she wants it. Yes, you're absolutely right. So you've watched Mama. I am so jealous of her setup. It's so cool. Yeah, and her streams are fun too, because she's kind of a little eclectic like me, but she's actually showing quilting skills, and I think we could all learn. Definitely. I know at least my binding and my corners, I can learn from her. Okay, so this preface. So Quest, I believe, is originally from Michigan, I think, and her files actually reside at Michigan State or the University of Michigan. I know that's a very bad thing in most states to mix up the University of and the whatever state. So please forgive me, but her stuff is in Michigan, and I think that's where she's from. But anyway, so I didn't exactly know why she wrote this book. You know, why about Arkansans? Well, she explains it in the preface. It's always good to read the preface, even though sometimes they're boring and sometimes they're just acknowledgments, and you often get some important information in the preface. So she says, in 1989, when invited to lecture on African American quilt history, I visited for the first time the Old State House Museum in Little Rock, Arkansas. Again, I want to go to this place. Sounds like they have got an amazing collection. At the same time, the Old State House Museum was hosting a national traveling exhibition of African American quilts. Now, she says this national traveling exhibition, many of the quilts were owned by the Old State House Museum. They were not, you know, I'm sure there were quilts they got from other places, but a lot of them they owned from their own collection. Hung in a spacious front gallery of the museum, the visiting quilts presented a spectacular picture, a melange of the most vivid colors. As the quilts were pieced in a free-form, improvisational manner, the juxtaposition of the brilliant blues, bold reds, and bright yellows had a closer affinity to modern abstract art than to the precision-oriented traditional American patchwork quilt. While acknowledging the electrifying visual impact of the traveling quilts, I, as a researcher of quilt history, began to probe for more information. And this is like, I picture Cuesta being the kind of person who's like, oh, wow, look at that. And then she's just like, question. A woman after my own heart. So she says, where were the quilts made? When were they made? And did the dates of the fabrics in the quilts confirm the dates delegated to them? That's a good, that's a good thing to point out. A lot of times people will say like, oh, this quilt was made, da-da-da-da. But then you look at the fabrics and you're like, well, maybe most of the fabrics are from that time period, but I also have some fabrics that are later. So we only date the quilt to the newest fabric. That's a rule of thumb. If you've never heard that before, even if a quilt has a bunch of old fabric in it, and you could say that this quilt has old fabric in it, but the date of the quilt, the date the quilt was made, should always be the newest fabric, because that fabric couldn't be in there if it was made earlier, unless it was used to mend the quilt. Had the quilt designs been assigned a specific name? Were the quilt makers identified as to name, birthplace, and age? Right? These are questions that are so important to quilt research. By reading the captions affixed to the gallery walls, I learned that the majority of the quilts had been made in southern regions of the country by persons who had been born and reared in the South. Most of the quilts were of recent vintage, having been constructed circa 1970 to the 1980s. In a smaller adjoining gallery, an entirely different group of quilts was on display. The museum curator announced, "These are our local quilts. All of them were made by Black Arkansans." In stark contrast to the traveling exhibit quilts in the larger gallery, the Arkansas Black-made quilts were characterized by subdued, soft colorations and had been, for the most part, fashioned in recognizable traditional quilt patterns. So isn't that interesting? So we spend all this time and, you've got Eli Leon looking at a handful of quilters who made stuff like this, yet you've got Black quilters who made what, we look at as traditional coloration and pattern, and we kind of ignore those because, those don't match the African American, vernacular as it pertains to quilts. Very interesting. Cuesta was like, hey, look at this. Don't say always. Don't use these absolutes because I can quickly prove you wrong. Some of the Arkansas quilts were quite old and predated the visiting quilts by many years. Obviously made as utilitarian bed covers, the Arkansas quilts showed signs of use, and their gentle colors could perhaps be attributed as much to laundering as age. Yet they were not threadbare, nor did they show significant fading, an indication the quilts had been cherished and given care. So even though that they were, signs of use, they still were kept in very good condition. The Old State House Museum curator said the museum was continuing to acquire Black Arkansans quilts and planned to build a sizable collection of their textile works. When those two groups of quilts side by side in adjoining galleries, the visiting quilts and the Black Arkansans ones, the dissimilarities were strikingly apparent. No better example of the diversity that exists in Black-made quilts could be found. Despite a widely accepted notion that Black quilt makers' works displayed a single aesthetic orientation based on unconscious cultural memories of their African homeland, that was some of what this man was saying. And also some of the stuff that Dobard was kind of hinting at, even though he does the next section of the book. Just saying. So let's see. Orientation based on unconscious cultural memories of their African homeland. These two groups of Black-made quilts illustrated the immense diversity that is the hallmark of African American quilt making. Excuse me. I vowed that someday I would return to the Old State House Museum and fully examine and study their collection of African American quilts. Although at that time it was a relatively small collection, I had never encountered such a rich source of African American quilt history in all the years I had pursued the investigations. Meanwhile, the Old State House Museum continued its quest to obtain more Black Arkansans quilts to achieve its ultimate goal, which was to mount an exhibition of the quilts to honor a heretofore largely ignored segment of the state's population, the African American quilt makers of Arkansas. By 1997, the Old State House Museum's collection numbered more than 80 quilts, so they'd done a good job of acquiring quilts. And I was invited to curate its proposed exhibition, A Piece of My Soul, Quilts by Black Arkansans. Remembering the museum's appealing quilts I had seen in 1989, so this is not quite 10 years between her first look and them contacting her, I wondered if the new additions to the collection would be equally as captivating. When the Old State House Museum staff persons, Gail Moore and Georgianne Cisco, unrolled the quilts on a long table, I was not disappointed. Instead, I stood transfixed, awed by the diversity of designs unfurled. Now the collection included quilts similar in construction to the traveling exhibit quilts of 1989. Improvisationally pieced quilts, novelty quilts, original designs, traditional quilts, antique quilts, recently made quilts, a huge variety, all made by Black Arkansans. We measured and turned the quilts, peered through magnifying glasses at the threads and stitches, matched pattern names, dated the fabrics, photographed the quilts, traced the families represented, pored over documents, all of the usual processes needed. But there was more. My personal responses to these exceptional quilts are recorded here in A Piece of My Soul, Quilts by Black Arkansans. So she was invited to curate this show, and I think the vast majority of the quilts in here belong to, as an outright purchase, to the Old State House Museum. I did not go through here and look individually, but like just about everything as I flip through is either a purchase or just part of the collection. So anyway, it's so interesting though. I mean, Cuesta, in what she's saying, she's doing all this really meticulous research and documentation, and the genealogy and the family stories matched up against the documentation, because that's really the best way as a historian to be able to get what you can as best as possible say is a true story, or as close as possible, is to get those family stories and those traditions, and then try to match it up against whatever history you can dig up genealogically or through some type of other documentation. And that is what is missing out of Hidden in Plain Sight, I'm sorry, hidden in plain view, you know, it is simply that being able to identify a particular person or family group and like look at the details of it. You know, did this family, was there some sort of diaspora in this family from a certain state to another state? You know, that probably tells you something. They didn't have any of that. So, you know, this is where I can't hammer home enough that Cuesta Benberry and researchers like her, they put together this information because they're coming with the receipts. They're, you know, they have you know, they might have a hypothesis, but then they search for the information to support that hypothesis. Or, you know, they are really diligent about documenting what is given to them. So, you know, is what it is. Again, I don't like to throw shade and criticize other researchers, but it's problematic in history documentation and being able to further stories about history when, you know, we make stuff up, or we perpetuate stories that sound good, or I mean, I hate to say make stuff up, because I really don't think by and large most people don't rewrite history that way. They rewrite history, you know, or craft a story or a narrative for history because it's what they want to be true, or they feel like they have enough information to make it true. Or, you know, in the case of a lot of the stuff I read you know, from Jacqueline Tobin's commentary was, well, if this is true, then surely this must be true, right? You know, so that's the problematic stuff. I mean, you know, this horse is dead by now. I have beat poor Giddy Up to death. So yeah, that was an interesting look at those two these two different Arkansan quilter communities and the quilts they were making. And I mean, all of them are gorgeous. I'd give my left arm for any one of these quilts in either of these books. They're fantastic. So on Thursday, I think we might do a little show and tell. We'll see. So stay tuned for that. As always, you know, I am here Mondays and Thursdays, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you are into reading the books, Jill and I, our friend Jill and I, have been doing quilt nerding with the Quilt Nerd community on Tuesday nights. We are streaming to YouTube right now, and that's been working pretty well, so I think we're going to stick with that. If you're not following us, go to look for Quilt Nerding on YouTube or on Facebook or on Instagram. And we're in all three of those places, and you can find us. And of course, I'm Stephanie Cake, or the Stephanie Cake, on all the social medias. So if you don't follow me, follow me. And I think I'm going to call it. I've got the usual Monday afternoon, evening / things to do. So I will see you guys either tomorrow night or on Thursday. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Mwah!